Hi, and welcome to our next session of Venture and Capital interviews. Today I'm actually very pleased to welcome the co-founders of Naluri. We've got Azran and we've got Jeremy, both welcome.
Hi, nice
Hi,
to meet
Steve.
you.
Now, I just want to kick off. What I'd love to do now, you guys have a fascinating story. Now, we will get on to Naluri because I said, I love that the space you're in, it's dealing with mental health, it's dealing with digitization, but you guys have actually had an incredible career, both yourselves in working with sort of early stage businesses and taking them to IPO, as well as you've seen probably one of the, I suppose, Asia's version of Netflix. You've overseen the launch of that and the growth of that. And I've got some questions around that. So just as a starting point, could you both kick off and give a little bit about your background prior to Naluri?
Sure, I'll start first, Steve. This is the third business that I've co-founded. For me, I guess, first the privilege of having to build an airline from scratch to IPO, as you mentioned, Iflix.
It was in 6 years as well. Like that's an incredible time frame to take a business from startup to IPO.
While going through the global financial crisis in our first year. So, you learn a lot of resilience and you lose a lot of hair. Iflix, as you know, from 0 to 20 million users in 20 countries in 3 years, and now Naluri. The common themes for me specifically are, how do I look at an existing industry and try to find ways to make services much more affordable and much more accessible, especially using technology and business innovation. Number two, I think, how do you scale that across Asia and specifically Southeast Asia? Because this is a very incredibly complex region with different languages, different regulatory frameworks. And I think third also, how do you build real B2B partnerships? Because even Iflix, you might think it's a consumer story, but it was really about deep partnerships with telcos, with device manufacturers like Samsung, as with Airasia. How do you work together with people like Airbus, like Rolls-Royce, airports, and of course with Naluri as well, with insurance companies and healthcare providers. So that's been my foundation. I started my career at McKinsey, and that's kind of my common theme with Jeremy.
Wow. And yourself, Jeremy?
Yeah, so my background has been basically healthcare. I come from a healthcare family. Both my parents are doctors. My older brother's a doctor as well. And like any good Asian kid, I had to do medicine as well.
Yeah, I was going to say.
Yeah, so I studied medicine at Oxford and worked as a doctor both in the US and the UK for a little bit before I joined McKinsey. And like Azran mentioned, that was the common ground between both of us. I spent about 6 years there, really sort of co-leading the healthcare practice in Southeast Asia, but also had the privilege of working in places like the US and the UK as well, both doing health system level work, but also in hospitals and insurance and medtech and pharma as well. I think that gave me a good breadth, I think, across the entire healthcare supply chain and ecosystem. But I think one thing that really drove me or inspired me was essentially how do we reimagine care delivery? Because I think there are a lot of problems with our existing care systems. There's a lot we could learn from more mature markets, and how do we bring that learnings back to places like Southeast Asia where we have very systemic challenges. But I think with the growth of technology and digitization, there is this opportunity to leapfrog a lot of the legacy problems that has been plaguing these mature markets. And I think with Naluri, a little bit is about how do we draw upon what are best practices that we've seen in other markets, and how do we then leverage technology to accelerate the adoption of those models.
So let's do a bit of a deep dive. Firstly, onto Airasia, right? Because I'm really curious as far as that process, and then move on to Iflix, because I want to ask you some questions about just around the business model, because you mentioned something interesting which I want to touch on. So just with Airasia, like that process, how was that going from that launch and then accessing funding for something which really hadn't been done by sort of an independent in Asia before? What was that process like? And then how was I said, from an experience point of view, it must have been an absolute roller coaster journey trying to figure out the business model, figure out, just all the different regions in Asia and all their nuances and how to attract customers and so forth, and raising capital for it at the same time. What was that process like?
Okay, let me try to make it as brief as possible. The initial fundraising process was a bit easy because it was 2007. Steve, if you remember, that was irrational exuberance. The moment we got
Yes.
Richard Branson on our cap table, it became easier to bring other institutional investors in. Frankly, if it had been 6 months later at the start of 2008, we wouldn't have even gotten started, because that's where
And that timing is just amazing, right? And I know there's other stories of companies selling just before that period, and others, like I had a friend that basically raised capital, literally during that period. And then as that sort of took out, then all the investors bailed on. So very well done on the timing.
No, it was just pure luck, right? But
Yeah.
I think to be able to survive 2008, 2009, 2010, we even had to do a rights issue to go back, cup in hand to existing investors to say, look, all the business plan assumptions were thrown out of the window. We need to keep going. But ultimately, in the run up to the IPO was figuring out the right business model that you could, really get institutional investors on board. And the breakthrough insight was to realize that actually in the airline business, it has nothing to do with whether you're full service or low cost. It has nothing to do with your short haul or long haul. And this is where a lot of analysts kind of didn't get it. The only thing that mattered was whether you could dominate the markets that you operated in. And therefore, for example, it required a massive strategic reshift. For example, I pulled out of Europe, withdrew from London and Paris, and everybody assumed that meant long haul doesn't work. But actually, what we wanted to do was to realign our capacity into this north-south axis, North Asia, Southeast Asia, Australia, dominate that, as opposed to spreading yourselves too thin, going east-west and going head-to-head with Emirates and Etihad and all of that. Once the investors understood there was a clear strategy where we were well positioned to become the #1 carrier going on this north-south axis, and something that Emirates and Etihad couldn't play in, that became the story that got investors on board for the IPO.
And how did you, just out of curiosity, how did you get to that point? Like, how did you get to that point in uncovering that strategy? Was it from conversations with investors? Was it from bringing analysts into the company or consultants?
Well, a little bit of that, but the main thing is learning from experience, right? So for example, we quickly realized we were making money in Melbourne and Taipei. And then that was because we had more capacity in Melbourne and Taipei than the legacy carriers, Malaysia Airlines, and even Taiwanese carriers. So when you have a #1 leadership position in a micro market, that's where the economics really pile in, right? But when we were flying to London, 1 flight a day, and Emirates has got 8 flights a day, you were getting decimated. So it became very clear that, if you wanted to go into a new market, you had to dominate from the start, even if it meant, investing in additional capacity. But the big breakthrough was to very quickly realize that a lot of my Australian customers were not coming to Malaysia, but were continuing on to China and North Asia. And a lot of the Chinese customers from Chengdu and Xi'an, all these places who don't have direct flights to Sydney, Melbourne, Perth, were using KL as a transit point. So now, instead of just the point-to-point traffic, you could get this big feeder traffic. And this went against the whole Ryanair, EasyJet, Southwest model of only point-to-point. But this is why you got to challenge existing norms and kind of discover new ways of unlocking value.
Brilliant. And going through the IPO process and the post listing, what was your biggest learnings about communications with investors and even the post IPO process for communications with investors?
Well, I think #1, it was a big learning experience dealing with risk management committees, audit committees, independent directors, where suddenly the conversation became about benchmarks, right? About who's done this before, rather than the willingness to try something completely new and unproven. Honestly, I struggled, right? And I think, and of course, unfortunately for us, 2014, suddenly we had 3 black swan events with MH370, a plane missing, MH17, a plane got shot down, and then QZ8501, a plane went down off of Indonesia, right? And I think that significantly affected our, our whole.
Yeah, definitely not good for the PR capacity, that's for sure.
Well, even sheer economics, because by doing the north-south axis, I had concentrated 70% of my capacity north-south, but China and Australia were the 2 markets that were deepest affected by these airline tragedies, right? And so, we shrank demand by about 30%. And again, I think this is where, a lot of investors are, again, very, very focused on, quarterly earnings, and everybody gets into this tailspin. Financiers all start to kind of really clamp down because they're all worried about short-term impact, as opposed to kind of really saying, hang on a second, like these things you'll tide through this if you figure out how to if there's a solid foundation in terms of the logic of that north-south axis.
Really interesting. And Jeremy, I'm going to move on to Iflix, right? I hope you don't mind answering some questions about Azran's. So what I found, I was there. So I said, I went to Patrick Grove's event at that time. And, I remember them telling the story about Iflix. And I remember the first thing that they were mentoring was about how the user growth was just through the roof. Now, what I understand was the biggest challenge that you face, and what I love about obviously Patrick's model is he takes something that's worked really well in Western countries, brings it to Asia, and obviously utilize technology as a base to do that. Very successful. I've just forgot the property company name. How bad is that? iProperty that was acquired by, and also Airasia and so forth. And then obviously Iflix was the next one. So, obviously very successful at doing that.
Right.
Now, one stat that I got that I thought was interesting, and I actually used to use it for all my workshops, was the initial capital raising for Iflix. Because what I found really interesting was that even though Patrick had been a successful entrepreneur, it was incredibly hard to raise seed money for Iflix.
115 investor rejections.
That is nuts. Like, who as a founder would think that you could build a business to over $500 million and still have issues with raising capital for your next venture?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Unbelievable. And then what did you learn about the difference between the Western business model and dealing business in Asia because it would say, logic would have to you, okay, Iflix, that makes sense, the Asian version of Netflix. How did you have to pivot that business to help us succeed? Because I understand that whilst there was lots of consumption early on from content, there was an issue in the monetization.
Absolutely, right. In fact, I kind of joked that in the first 4 months, the only people who were willing to convert from that 30-day free trial to a paid account were 100 of my own friends and family members that I arm twisted to convert, right? No one else did.
I found that interesting, by the way, because I obviously knew about that, but I found that really interesting. There was such a struggle to get people to convert to pay for content.
Absolutely. And, but the breakthrough was when you start to realize people were watching it until someone came to me and said, I'm on my 4th free trial. I love your content. I just don't like the idea of pay for it, right? Because it's so easy to sign up for a new account with a new Gmail address or even a new mobile phone. So, that breakthrough came and realized, okay, look, we've got something that people want. The idea of paying for content is anathema in Southeast Asia. So who benefits from people watching content? And that was the first pivot, which is to telcos. Because telcos was seeing their voice and SMS revenues plummeting. Data is the only one that's growing. And video is 70% of bandwidth, right? So if you really want to take off demand for data, nothing better than to give people a free video content.
And how did you come up with that idea? Once again, was that from investors' discussions? Was that board level? Was that consultants coming in? Or was that just someone had a bright idea in the middle of the night? And
actually, to me, here's the big learning, right? You've got to have conversations with your partners at the senior level. In this case, for example, the CEO of a telco. We started the first conversation with that first telco as the standard telco model of carrier billing, right? That means they offer your digital service to their customers, and then they become a payment channel, either to take the prepaid credit or the postpaid charge on the bill. That's where we realized hardly anyone was converting, right? But in that process, we say, look, let's take a punt, right? What if we bundle this as part of your postpaid service so that people get it for free for 12 months, right? And most telcos kind of showed us the door, but one telco said, yeah, let's do this and learn and measure. And the moment we could do that, we showed that, people were consuming 2 additional gigabytes incremental with Iflix than without. And 2 gigabytes then was priced at about, $4 to $5. But if they were paying us, $1.70, that's a very healthy margin. And then you add on the fact that, it's much more sticky because of television series, right? So telco churn rates are notoriously high at about 50% in this part of the world, right? And so even if you can save one extra month, that's actually a lot of value to telcos. But that means you have to, the conversation needs to be with the CEO or the chief marketing officer and not head of digital services.
And when you're actually going through that now you're obviously talking about this nice and calm, you're relaxed about it. I can only imagine the stress that you're under when you've raised a ton of money and you're going and you're trying to figure out, okay, why are people not converting? And of course, every investor you're going to chat to, they're going to say, well, Azran, show me your conversion rate. How many people are converting from your 30 days, right? How are you managing the stress and also still bring in more investors whilst going through these sort of learning periods?
I think the single biggest lesson for me is the team, right? Because we all kind of go through different stress periods on our own. But for example, if I'm incredibly down and I have Mark or Luke or Patrick, we balance each other out, right? I think that's why, so I'm a huge believer in making sure that the co-founders are naturally supportive.
Yeah. And now, obviously, this can lead on to Naluri, right? Because I think it's a perfect segue. And you talk about the management of stress. So let's go into the history of the company, why you actually started, and what you're looking to do with it.
Okay, so I'll start, and I'll bring Jeremy into this picture. I think part of my process of engaging with folks on Iflix was another trip to San Francisco to catch up with some former Stanford classmates, and one of them was a co-founder of a company called Omada Health. And when we compared notes, I said, "Oh, look, we're doing the same thing, except I'm using digital technology to get people addicted to mindless TV entertainment, and using the same thing to get people addicted to a healthier life, right?" And the reason why I felt that was a very powerful thing was also personally, I remember losing my dad 9 years ago because he was dealing with cancer and diabetes at the same time. And the healthcare system was only focused on his physical care, right? Surgery, medication, chemo, radiotherapy. No one knew about the depression and anxiety that someone who's been diagnosed with cancers to go through. And that depression and anxiety, when you don't get proper support, spirals and causes him to miss his chemo, not take his medication properly, and just kind of creates this vicious circle, right? And we didn't even know about like the importance of mental health when you're dealing with these chronic conditions. So that for me was the very interesting problem statement. I had the Omada model, just like we had the Netflix model, but how did you have to adapt it to this market? And that's kind of why I say at least there's a starting point. And part of my exercise then was I told Mark and Patrick, look, I want to take 3 months and just spend 100% of my time talking to people in the industry, insurers, employers, healthcare providers, doctors. And in that journey, I went back to McKinsey, and that's where I got to meet Jeremy.
Interesting. Now, Jeremy, I'm going to ask this question to you. So how do you deal with, and I've sort of spoken about this in Asia, with different investors previously, mental health is pretty much a taboo subject in Asia. It's not really talked. In Australia, it's very openly talked about. I'm sure you guys would have heard when James Packer come out and talked about his mental health issues. It's not, how can I put it? And there's been other founders that have put it on the map as a discussion to have. I said, I know from myself, we've done workshops in the area. We've had sessions on it because we're big. But in Asia, it's not really like, how have you sort of navigated that, and how, and obviously you've got government support, which I think is fantastic, but how are you navigating that, and how are you seeing the sort of mood change?
Yeah, I think you're completely right. I think, Asia has a much lower base, right, in terms of acceptance of this. But I think over the last 2 years, we've seen a massive shift actually in people's openness to talk about the subject and addressing it. And I'll say even in our short time as Naluri, in us operating in Southeast Asia, it started essentially with mental health packaged under an umbrella of chronic disease management services, because as part of what we do, we believe that, to truly take a very, user-centric or patient-centric view to healthcare, you have to address the chronic disease element through doctors and dietitians and fitness coaches, but also the mental health element. So a lot of our mental health services were under the umbrella of chronic disease management. And it's only over the last year or so where, COVID has accelerated this conversation, right, of mental health, of staying at home and working, that we actually have clients seeking us out specifically for mental health support. So there is this, I think, big swing of people's openness to talk about mental health. I think we still have a long way to go, because if you think about the reimbursement structures of mental health, that's pretty much non-existent. So a lot of these costs, you either need, someone in a company that, has the foresight to say, actually, my employee base needs this and I will pay for it, or someone that pays out of pocket. So I think, whereas in places like Australia, like you said, there is funding and support from all the way from the governmental level, right, to address this. I think that's probably the next big change we need in Asia to actually, change this short-term acceptance of mental health to something that will grow and continue to shape healthcare in the future.
Now, I imagine you're looking to partner with different service providers for the delivery. So what does that look like?
Yeah, so I think specifically what we want to do is to play a role in managing chronic diseases, right? Whether it's, physical elements or mental health elements within the community. So we don't want to replace the primary care physicians. We don't want to replace the hospitals. We are not getting involved into acute care as well, break a leg, flu, infectious diseases. And so what we do try to own and build and be really good at is building this team of multidisciplinary professionals. They would be doctors or psychologists or dietitians and fitness coaches. Get them to really work in a very different way. Get them to work as a team. Get to know the individual and give support in a very longitudinal fashion, right? So it's this same team that will talk to you on day one, across the next few weeks, across the next few months, so they get to know you and gives you a better chance to actually change your behaviors over time. However, when we do try to partner these elements that we don't want to replace, because it's not something that we're good at, it's not something that we can scale in. So we do try to partner with the the healthcare providers, whether it's hospitals or GP clinics. We do partner the payers or the insurers, right? This would be the private insurers, or sometimes from the public side as well. And also we do try to partner the corporates. How do they think about their wellness programs? And together we try to tie all three together in our services. So when we go and say, let's serve a corporate to help their population get healthy, we do bring in services, from the lab diagnostics to come in to test the people. We do bring in insurers into the conversation.
What sort of test are you doing?
Yeah, so we try to stick to things that are easily understandable and quantifiable. So because we work in the chronic disease space, we start mainly with cardiometabolic diseases. So these would be obesity and diabetes and hypertension. So we measure BMI, we measure blood pressure, we measure HbA1c, which is a measure of your blood glucose, and blood cholesterol levels as well. So it gives you the markers, right, of the high, the three highs. Hypertension, hypercholesterolemia, and high blood pressure. And then we also measure mental health. So we do measure mental health, trying to use a quantitative sort of survey. And one that we use most commonly is called DAS21, which actually has its origin in Australia. So this actually gives you depression, anxiety, and stress as a quantitative number relative to the normal population. And you can then be scored to say whether you're normal, mild, moderate, severe, or extremely severe.
And let's say I get put in the extremely severe category. What happens to me next? How am I taken through the process? How's that managed digitally? How am I making adjustments to my life?
Yeah, so the first set that we do, is to actually identify these people that have high risk factors. Our solution is not for everyone. Once they get identified as these high risk, what we do then is we onboard them onto the program. The first part is getting them to meet their care team, right? This would be the psychologists, the dietitians, the doctors, and with all our programs, there'll always be a head coach. The head coach traditionally is usually the psychologist, and they coordinate the care around you. And really that first week is about building up this therapeutic relationship with this care team. And then over time, they get to know you a little bit better, get to dig deeper, get to work on different aspects of your health and your behavior. And this goes on for many months. Traditionally, a lot of programs runs at least for 4 months, where we measure these, BMI, blood pressure, blood results on day 0, but then also measure it 4 months later. And the entire process of this is delivered digitally. We've anchored very heavily on a smartphone because most people in Southeast Asia has a smartphone, but other sort of devices or wearables they see that's quite common in Western markets, the price point's often too expensive for it. So we don't really anchor too much on that. Rather, we just anchor on what your smartphone could do. And the entire journey of that really is, the conversations that you have with this coaching team that problem solves with you, keeps you accountable. But then we've also developed other features within the app itself to help augment this behavioral coaching program. So we have things like a food journal to measure your diet intake. We have a thought journal to measure your mood and thoughts. We have a body of knowledge that we've packaged into modules, little bite-sized educational pieces you could do every single day. And we've also connected to other wearables if you have them. So we pull steps data from Google Fit or Apple Health. We actually have a weighing scale as well that we can give to people that measures your weight and body fat.
One interesting thing, one of our clients is a company called NeuroCare Group, and I absolutely love, once again, I love what they do. It's got a digital aspect, and they've also got a physical aspect to their service. And, when I was doing one of these interviews with Thomas, he mentioned that one of the most important things they found for people that are struggling with mental health is often they have really bad sleep and really bad diet. I thought that was an interesting sort of observation that they'd come across.
Yeah, completely. And I think this is why in addressing a lot of mental health, we've got to think about the other elements of the individual. And that's why we believe a lot in this multidisciplinary approach. The overlap of these conditions are so high, right? Oftentimes you don't have just depression as a standalone, you have it with something else, like how oftentimes with obesity, you will have depression, or with, high blood pressure, you will have anxiety. And I think addressing all of the elements is really, really key. And actually what we are trying to do, like you mentioned earlier, in trying to understand the pathways of fundraising, we're trying to understand what contributes to the identification of these diseases and how do they progress over time, and hopefully get to the point where we can start to predict some of this, so that almost like how you would take a blood test that measures today, okay, if my HbA1c is high, I'm at risk of diabetes. We want to take that and these analog physical biomarkers and create essentially digital biomarkers that gives us prediction of your mental health condition. So for example, one of these things could be, the way that you chat with us, in a text, or the way that you do certain activities gives us an indication of your likelihood, which then customizes on how we reach out to you, make it a lot more proactive as well.
I love that. So one thing I got taught really early on was just the power of language and the power of words, and how you communicate to yourself has always been interesting. Now, you guys have had great success in taking, let's say, complex offerings and bringing them to market, with partners and at scale. How does that rollout look for Naluri?
I think it's always starts with firstly finding these early adopters that are almost just willing to kind of bet me. I think, like Azran mentioned, finding that first telco that's willing to build the case with you. And I think similarly for us, we managed to find early partners that we could say, okay, well, we're just willing to kind of bet and use your services. And through that, then we have this body of evidence that, hey, your solution actually really returns a lot of cost savings based on the ability to get these people healthy, and therefore conversations that we have with other people, we could also refer back to these clients. I think through that, working with the large companies, working with the large insurers, they then, I guess through word of mouth, other companies are so more willing to work with us. I think that just creates a snowball effect over time. And I think what we've also found that to be a bit of a blessing is that a lot of these companies have footprints in other markets as well, that allows us then to, expand to these markets in a more soft launch way, where we already have like an anchor in those markets, as opposed to just trying to blindly go in and build services from the ground up.
And if you, and Azran, if you were to paint your ideal world about what the next 3 to 5 years looks like, how do you see that unfolding? Who do you see the key partners as? And how do you see, I suppose, like I suppose, how do you build that cycle of growth in your area?
I think for me, the gold standard that we want to aspire to is for doctors to prescribe Naluri as a viable digital treatment to supplement, or even
isn't it just such a base? It sounds so simple in theory, right? And it makes it, like, for me, I do my best to, I do my best to be as healthy as possible. But it's interesting how you say that, because obviously the doctor sort of typical methodology is to prescribe some type of pill, whether it be suited for anxiety, depression, whatever it may be, rather than, okay, let's help you start eating better and get some sleep.
Right.
And start tracking your own progression.
Yeah. So to get to that standard, the other thing we also have to do is for insurance companies to say this is a standard reimbursable, right? Because if you want Naluri, we're going to pay for you because the benefits are very clear and quantifiable. right?
Yeah.
So that is why, with Jeremy working very, very closely with insurance companies to build that quantitative base so that you can feed into the actual models to get to that stage. And to build on that expansion, the other part is how do you build that credibility so that doctors will say, hey, this is a standard treatment program. That often requires governments to come in, because most doctors will say,
Yes.
is this approved by governments, right? And that's where you have to have clinical standards, clinical research.
Yes.
And in Southeast Asia specifically, because the regulatory framework is so underdeveloped, we have to shape it rather than play within it. And in this case, for example, Jeremy's, a big part of 2021 is going to Europe to do clinical research there to get a European CE mark. Because from my experience, especially with aviation, if you want to change regulations, trying to just kind of have conversations with your regulator doesn't work. But if you give them case studies, here's a standard from a developed market that they recognize, it's a lot easier.
The time-tested and proven method of making someone's life easier and allowing them to be lazy by actually finding someone else that's already done the work.
That's right.
Time-tested and proven in dealing with bureaucratic systems.
Yes.
Now, as a final, is there any sort of final things you'd like to mention about just your own journeys and your own experience as founders, and just as far as what you see for the journey ahead, and just even in just general 2021, like are you seeing the rise in sort of mental health issues, which I'm sure we are, like I'm sure that's pretty obvious, but then what does that look like sort of going past and sort of past 2021?
I'll start and I'll let Jeremy have the closing word. For me, I think this is a very important path towards the future of personalized medicine, where medicine is no longer, for example, with COVID-19 vaccines, you're trying to do it on a population and a bell curve distribution. You understand someone's DNA, their genetic makeup, right? And there's a lot of people doing that. You understand their microbiomes. There are a lot of people doing that. And we are a partner with them. And your biomarkers, like your blood test results, your urine results. But behavior and mental health is as equally important as the fourth dimension of that personalization. And what we're trying to do is we try to create that and quantify and structure that, right? What does it mean to have things like quantifying your resilience, your readiness to change, your growth mindset, your willingness to work with others in a scale that then helps you predict and personalize, what do I help you with, when do I help you with, and the style that I help you with, together with your DNA and your microbiomes and your biomarkers, so that it becomes really personalized and tailored. And that's what really excites me.
I love that you say that. Sorry, I'll let you go. I love that you say that. We did an interview with Dr. Ruchi Dana, who's a family officer out of the Middle East, and said basically the same thing. And also one of our advisors, who's the chairman of NRMA, which is Australia's largest sort of motor insurer, said that personalized healthcare industry is, like, from his perspective, I don't even said, either said it was like the next $1 trillion industry, that and sort of energy infrastructure, but that personalized healthcare is massive going forward. And yourself, Jeremy?
Yeah, I think it's similar along those lines, right? I think, the ability to reshape, entire care delivery infrastructure in places in Southeast Asia. I think there's this ability to just completely leapfrog, and experiment completely new models. And I think, us being part of that journey, hopefully in 10 years time, our idea of healthcare, where it's so hospital based, it will be completely different. And I think,
statistic based, if you think about it.
Exactly, right? I mean, right now you go see a doctor, you say, oh, what sort of doctor should I see? And the labels are all just, disease pathways, right? Like, it's my heart or my gut, nobody talks about you as a person. And I think that's the core shift we need as we think about personalized medicine. It's not only, about your genetics, but actually as you as a person, what is everything around you that shapes your own health status, which, like you mentioned earlier, is these other things, how you sleep, how you eat. I think that's going to be really exciting as we move along in this journey.
Well, gents, absolutely love what you're doing. You guys have a fascinating story to tell. Where can people find out more information?
They can go to our website, www.naluri.life, or they can email us as well. My email is at jeremy@naluri.life.
Azran@naluri.life.
And also, we've got your information on our site. Gents, I really appreciate your time. As I said, you guys have a fascinating story. Absolutely love what you're doing. And really, it's a pleasure for us to be working with you, and wish you all the best in the future.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Steve.